Hey, everybody, welcome to this episode of The Strategic Thinker. I'm Dr. John Meis, and I'm here with Drew Schaefer. How you doing, Drew?
Great. How are you doing, Dr. Meese?
I'm doing fantastic. Our topic for today is acquisitions, and what are some of the places where we've seen groups struggle or have problems or missteps. Trying to point out just a few places that are relatively common that we've seen that. So the first one is understanding the legal structure of what you're buying. So, Drew, tell me what some of the things that you've seen that have caused this to be problematic.
I think the first thing is understanding your own existing legal structure. A lot of groups grow organically or opportunistically, maybe weren't planning on it. And so um, there's rules as far as what type of legal entities can own or have agreements with other legal entities. So making sure you understand that before getting into the documentation phase and really making sure that can facilitate growth in advance of growth, and not just maybe this opportunity, but future opportunities can tuck in easily as well.
Mapping out your own structure and their structure in somewhat of a box format to help communicate that to your counsel, because this is a place where you certainly want your counsel to be fully informed and understand the complete thing so that they can make sure that whatever structure you end up with is compliant with the laws in whatever state or states that you're in. So this is an opportunity to clean up complexity. As organizations grow, you have more and more entities, and when you're at the point of doing an acquisition, it's a good time to look at your own complexity, look at the legal complexity of the thing that you're acquiring, and see if there's a better or simpler way. It's a good time to get rid of complexity, isn't it?
Yeah, and there's naturally, as you grow, there will be added complexities that are required from a regulatory standpoint as well. So it's definitely a balance of the two as far as compliance versus ease of administration.
And so another thing that is pretty important to understand is where the money flows. So why is that so important?
Well, because at the end of the day, that's what you're buying the rights to, and that's what you'll be able to borrow against as well. So if you're taking on any sort of debt to finance the acquisition, the bankers are really going to want to make sure they understand what legal rights to what cash flows the borrowing entity or you personally have. And if you don't have your head around that, then they're not going to have as much confidence that you know what you're buying either.
Yeah. And the last thing you want to do is not have the rights to the cash flow that you borrowed the money to get.
Exactly.
That's a spot to be in, right? And it can happen, relatively simply. So just making sure that you understand that, making sure that you understand that before you go to financing, so that your lenders will have a high level of confidence in you, makes more opportunities for lending happen, and may affect interest rates and fees paid, etc. Very good. So the second major topic here, Drew, is understanding past cash flows and future cash flows. Because just because the cash flow was there in the past doesn't mean it's going to be there in the future, and that would affect the pricing. What you would pay for a practice. It also might affect, if you have multiple practices that you're looking at, it may allow you to rank them as to which is the best opportunity and not. So talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, I think a lot of times we hear in the dental space somebody getting an X multiple of their earnings or EBITDA, and that's always reported as of the historical earnings, but really what you're buying is the future cash flow. So it's not from a seller's perspective, that's pretty standard. But from a buyer's perspective, you should really look at it based off of what you're expecting the future cash flows to be. So a couple of scenarios to kind of describe this. First, if you're, let's say you're buying a practice that has a super producer in it, but the super producer is going to retire. Well, the historical cash flows are not going to be representative of the future cash flows unless you can somehow replicate that super producer and have the golden handcuffs on them to keep them around. Otherwise, profitability will very likely decrease, and you're overpaying for those future cash flows.
And the super producer really, there really is a discount that logically can be applied to a practice with a super, because you're not going to be able to replicate it. And the super producer will tell you, well, it's not me, it's the systems, it's the team, it's how we all work together. And while there's some truth to that, you and I, Drew, have seen where a high producer goes from one practice to another practice, and the practice that they started in goes down after they leave, even though it's the same people and the same systems, right? And the practice that they move into goes up and matches where they were before. So it really is very difficult to replicate a super producer.
Yeah. And on the other end, you might have a practice that has marginal, if any, income. So you're thinking, this is an asset sale essentially. But at the same time, maybe they have a very young doctor that's still ascending in skill set and productivity. You have a couple of ops that aren't even equipped that you could expand into. So if you look at what you've been able to do with other practices and can kind of translate that into this opportunity, you'd be willing to pay worth more than just for the assets for what you could really build that practice into ultimately.
Yeah. So it's an age-old question. Do you pay for what's there, or would you pay more for more potential? And of course, it's a competitive marketplace. So you are competing with other groups for any acquisition. And so when it comes down to really determining a price, it's really good to understand whether there's more opportunity there or whether it's operating at 100%. I'm just curious, Drew, which do you prefer? The ones that have some potential, or the ones that are dialed in, locked in, right, performing right at capacity?
I like the potential. I think those that are dialed in, performing at capacity, they're never able to sustain it in the long run. So you might have a good run, it might be short, it might be long. Whereas on those with potential, there's always room to do better and do more. So as long as you're not overpricing what you're buying it as, it can really be more, there's more of a windfall available to you there.
I think it really can affect dramatically the return on investment. If you're getting something, and I'm not big on buying disasters.
Right.
But you buy one that's performing okay, but has the opportunity to perform a lot better. I think there is less risk than buying the disaster, and yet there still is considerable upside improving your ROI.
Yep.
So the next thing I thought we'd talk about a little bit is about culture. And our first step when we're looking at a potential acquisition is we want to understand the culture of what's there. Do they have the same values? Do they think the same way about patient care? Do they think the same way about teamwork? Would be some examples of things that are really important. And if you have very, very different cultures on those things, the integration is going to be challenging, and it's going to take longer. It's going to take more time, more work. If it's not in the same location as where you are, it's going to mean more travel as you try to draw that acquired practice or practices into your culture. When there's a significant culture difference, we know that there's also likely to be greater team turnover. Right. So culture shows up all kinds of places, mission, vision, values, but it also shows up in things like comp and benefits. So why don't you talk about that a little bit, Drew?
Yeah, I think that's a particularly sensitive area. Anytime there's change in ownership, especially for an acquired practice, what does that mean for my compensation, my benefits, my security ultimately? And I think that's where you can see a lot of pitfalls in trying to balance getting everybody on board with the same structure and almost forcing everything, but there also being too much going at once. So I think it's important to be mindful of the various stresses in acquiring a new practice. If you're changing their practice management software, there's just a lot of change.
Yep.
So as best you can stage this out over time with benefits, if you can wait till the next open enrollment period for doctor contracts, having a grace period to transition them to your standard contracts while showing them that they won't go backwards. If anything, they'll make more. It'll go a lot to gain their trust and help them appreciate your culture and really what you're trying to build, as opposed to just forcing it down their throats.
Yeah. And we've seen that, far too frequently, where too many changes are made in too short a period of time, which puts too much stress on the team. And then the team starts to rattle, morale drops, and people start leaving. Now we've got new people in the mix, and it just becomes really kind of a challenge. Another place where we see this be a particular challenge is maybe in an individual practice that has had employees that have been long-standing employees, where they just had they gave a X% raise every year. Yep. Well, if somebody's there for 25 years, that X%, they might be being paid way outside of the range of what's normal for that position. So how do you manage that, right? So that's a place where we've seen an awful lot of difficulty. And any thoughts on that, Drew?
Yeah, I mean, there's a couple of things. It depends on, first of all, the person's contributions, and in a lot of the scenarios, they're making themselves the doctor very dependent on them and really ingraining themselves in everything to try to justify it. I mean, I think there's two key elements to look at: is who will know that, and how will other similar roles feel about that, because that can create a lot of drama. And at the same time, did you factor that into how much you're paying for the practice? And so if you're factoring in overpaying that, it's one thing, but you're always going to have to deal with the drama of it, and there will be drama with that. So
there'll be drama. There will be.
There's no way around that.
Yeah, we like to think that, well, everybody will keep their pay, to themselves, keep that private. We ask people to keep it private. There's no such thing as a secret in a dental organization, is there?
No, and just the best you can try to address it with the seller beforehand. A lot of times they understand they're overpaid, and that's what they've been doing. That's been their security blanket. But at the same time, if you're buying them, they have a lot more resources available to them now, where they don't need that security blanket. So a lot of times it ends up being a non-issue too, if you just have that direct conversation.
Yeah. When the seller understands that the excess pay is costing him 3, 4, 5 times that in practice value, that often is a pretty good driver for them to find another solution for that. The other thing that we've seen is practices that don't make any changes on the pay side, for sure, until maybe a year later, just because many of them won't be there by that right. time. So when they peel off, then the new people coming in are in your regular pay ranges. And then when it comes to benefits, there are some regulatory issues there about having different benefits in affiliated service groups. So have to be a little bit cautious about that and make sure that we aren't creating a regulatory problem.
Right. And that goes back to the legal structure and everything as well. So yeah. Yep.
All right, very good. Well, thanks, Drew, for going through these acquisition stumbling spots. I appreciate that very much. And so thanks, everybody, for being on this episode of The Strategic Thinker. We'll see you next time.